If Jesus walked into a room full of people now, perhaps almost no one would recognize him. He would not arrive surrounded by visible light. He would not wear a perfectly clean white robe. His hair would probably not fall over his shoulders as in paintings, and his eyes would not necessarily have the light color that so many artists have chosen for centuries. Perhaps he would pass before us as an ordinary Middle Eastern man, with his face marked by the sun, his feet covered in dust from the roads and clothes so simple that no one would imagine they were looking at the figure who would change the history of the world. And that's exactly where the mystery begins. For centuries, millions of people have learned to recognize Jesus from images created long after his death. In churches, films, books, and paintings, he appears tall, with fair skin, long hair, a perfectly shaped beard, and clothes that appear to have never touched the ground. But no person from his time left a portrait of him. The Gospels do not say what color his eyes were. They do not describe the shape of his nose. They do not record his height, and they do not even explain what his hair was like. They tell what Jesus taught, what he did, where he walked, and how he treated people, but they remain almost completely silent about what he looked like. This means that everything we will see needs to be separated very carefully. There is what the texts really say, what archaeology allows us to reconstruct, and what remains just a possibility. Let's not invent a face for Jesus. Let's enter the world in which he lived and observe the men of Galilee, the clothes worn by simple people, the languages heard in the villages, the houses, the food, the work, the heat, the dust, and the rhythm of a life that was very different from ours. We are living in days when prophecies are being fulfilled before our eyes, but the majority still walk in darkness, trapped in incomplete truths that have been carefully hidden from humanity over the centuries. Now think. What if precisely what was taken from the scriptures contained answers that you have been looking for years? Answers that can illuminate your path, strengthen your faith, and reveal the true purpose of Jesus' coming. That's why I prepared the powerful digital book for you, Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed. This book is not just a read. It is a spiritual awakening, a tool made for those who want to go beyond the surface, free themselves from manipulation, and reconnect with the authentic Christ, without filters, without distortions, without human interests. Download it now. It is available in the first pinned comment. But be careful. There are very few units left, and it will be removed soon because it contains spiritually sensitive information. Don't wait for the world to fall apart to get what you already feel you need. Click now, download your copy, and allow this truth to begin to transform your life. If you are one of the first to download, come back here and write, Amen. This will be your act of faith, and today, God can open a door that you never knew was about to open. Maybe at the end of this journey, you won't be able to draw every line of Jesus' face, but you will be able to imagine it in a much more human, historical, and close to reality way. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because this won't just be a video about what Jesus looks like. It will be a journey to the streets, the houses, and the paths that he really knew. And some of the information we will see may forever change the way you imagine scenes from the Gospels. The first thing we need to accept is uncomfortable for many people. The historical Jesus probably looked much more like the Middle Easterners of his time than the European depictions that became popular centuries later. Jesus was Jewish, grew up in Galilee, and lived in territory controlled by the Roman Empire during the 1st century. By comparing human remains, ancient images, and archaeological information from the region, researchers suggest that a Jewish man from Judea or Galilee would likely have brown eyes, dark hair, and skin tones that could range from olive to brown. This does not allow us to know the exact tone of Jesus' skin, but it makes the image of a man with extremely fair skin, golden hair, and blue eyes very unlikely. His face was probably a familiar face to anyone living in Galilee. He did not need to possess an extraordinary physical characteristic to be recognized. In fact, the silence of the Gospels about his appearance may indicate just this. Physically, Jesus was not so different from the men around him. When the authorities went to arrest him, Judas had to identify him among the disciples. The episode does not prove that everyone looked the same, but it does suggest that Jesus did not. He was surrounded by a visual aura that was impossible to ignore. He could be in the middle of a group and be confused with the others. Imagine this scene for a moment without the cinematic effects. It's night. There is little lighting. The torch flames move with the wind. Men wear similar robes, have similar hair and beards, and are gathered in a garden. Soldiers don't walk in and immediately point to the tallest, fairest, or most majestic man. They depend on a signal. Judas approaches and identifies him. Maybe Jesus didn't have a face that attracted attention before he started speaking. Perhaps his strength lay precisely in the contrast between an ordinary appearance and words that no one could forget. We also don't know his height. Studies of human remains from the region indicate that many men from that period were shorter than the male average in several modern countries. Some reconstructions work with an approximate height of around 1.65 meters, but this is just a population average, not a measurement of Jesus. To say that he was exactly a certain height would be going beyond what the evidence allows. The most we can say is that he probably didn't have the tall stature that many films choose to make him stand out from his disciples. But don't confuse short height with physical weakness. Jesus' life required endurance. He grew up in a world without automobiles, elevators, running water, or electrical machines. Walking was not an occasional exercise. It was part of existence. During his ministry, he passed through villages, climbed hills, traveled rough roads, and traveled between Galilee and Jerusalem. A walk between regions could last days. The terrain was rocky, uphill, downhill, hot during the day and cold on certain nights. His body, therefore, was probably adapted to exertion, not necessarily muscular like a Hollywood-created warrior, but tough like the body of someone used to working with their hands and walking long distances. The legs would be strengthened by the journeys. The skin on your feet could show marks even when wearing sandals. The hands would probably not be delicate. The Gospel of Mark calls Jesus tekton, a Greek word often translated as carpenter, but its meaning can be broader, referring to a craftsman or construction worker. In a small village like Nazareth, this work could involve wood, stone, repairs, tools, structures, and different manual services. We should not necessarily imagine a workshop organized like a modern carpentry shop, with refined furniture and electrical instruments. The work was physical, slow, and required practical skill. This changes the way you imagine your hands. The hands that would later touch patients may already have small scars from work. The fingers that would break the bread could have been hardened by repeated contact with tools and rough materials. The applause would not belong to someone who spent his entire youth away from physical effort. Before walking among crowds, Jesus lived years about which the Gospels tell almost nothing. And for much of this period, you probably experienced the fatigue of a common worker. Maybe you woke up with pain in your arms after a demanding day. Perhaps he had already felt a splinter penetrate his skin. Perhaps he knew the weight of carrying materials under the sun. When he later talked about yokes, seeds, buildings, stones, doors, workers, wages, and harvests, he was not using images from a distant world. He was speaking from a reality that he knew up close. What about hair? This is one of the characteristics that most differentiate the probable Jesus from the Jesus present in many paintings. The image of long, straight hair parted in the middle has become so well known that it seems to be part of the Gospels themselves. But it doesn't. No Gospel states that Jesus had long hair. Ancient depictions show a wide variety of styles, and researcher Joan Taylor argues that an average Jewish man from that period would likely have had relatively short, perhaps slightly disheveled hair, especially when traveling. This does not mean a modern cut, made by a machine and perfectly aligned. The tools were different, the habits were different, and itinerant people would not have constant access to the same care. Hair could grow unevenly between one cut and another. It could get covered in dust after a long walk. Sweat would make some strands stick to your forehead. The wind in the region would disorganize them. The idea that every holy man must have very long hair may arise from confusion with the Nazarites, people who took special vows mentioned in the Hebrew scriptures. Samson is the best-known example. But Jesus of Nazareth should not be confused with a Nazarite just because the word sounds similar. Nazareth was his city. Nazarite was the person submitted to a certain vote. The Gospels even show Jesus drinking wine, something that would not fit with the traditional restrictions of a Nazirite vow. As for the beard, he probably had one. Beards were common among adult Jewish men, although length and care varied. Again, we should not necessarily imagine the long, shiny, symmetrical beard of religious works. During a life of travel, it could be short, rough, and irregular. The weather, dust, and days spent outside would leave marks on their appearance. Jesus probably didn't wake up every day looking ready for a painting. At times, after sleeping outdoors or in a house full of visitors, your face may appear tired. After a night of prayer, signs might appear around the eyes. During periods of fasting, your appearance could become thinner. After walking under the sun, the skin would feel sweaty. After facing wind and dust, his hair and beard would not remain perfectly groomed. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention. Stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. This humanity does not diminish Jesus. On the contrary, it makes even more profound the Christian claim that he has truly entered the human experience. He wouldn't have just looked human from a distance. I would have felt the body, the weight, the hunger, the heat, the cold, and the tiredness. The Gospels themselves do not hide these moments. Jesus feels hungry. He asks for water. Sleep during a crossing. He sits tiredly near a well. He cries when a friend dies. Look for moments of isolation. On certain occasions, he tries to stay away from the crowds. These are details that often go unnoticed because we have become accustomed to imagining a Jesus floating above common limitations. But the texts present someone who, despite carrying out his mission, experiences the demands of his body. And the eyes of Jesus? This is perhaps one of the most emotional questions, because people like to imagine what it would be like to be looked at by him. Historically, the most likely answer is simple: brown or dark brown eyes, as were common among the inhabitants of the region. There is no reliable evidence that he had green, blue, or unusually colored eyes. But the importance of Jesus' eyes in the Gospels is not in their color. It's in the way he saw people. He notices individuals that the crowd ignored. Look at a rich man and feel love for him. Observe a widow offering a small sum. He sees marginalized people, children kept away by adults, sick people hidden among the people, and disciples dominated by fear. The authors do not describe the shade of their eyes, but they repeatedly describe what their gaze met. Maybe that's why we didn't get a physical portrait. The Gospels seem more interested in showing how Jesus saw than in explaining what his eyes looked like. If this reconstruction is already changing your image of Jesus, share this video with someone who also grew up seeing only traditional representations. Many people have never had the opportunity to separate Jesus from art, and Jesus inserted into history. Sharing this content can open a deep conversation about faith, culture, and humanity. Now we need to talk about something that almost never appears in films: Jesus' tongue. When you read Jesus' words in Portuguese, it seems natural to imagine him uttering those same phrases. When a person reads in Spanish, English, Italian, or French, their mind produces the same illusion. But Jesus spoke none of these languages. Even the form Jesus, so familiar to us, went through a path of linguistic transformations before reaching Portuguese. In his environment, his name would probably be pronounced in a way close to Yeshua. It was a well-known Jewish name and related to the name Joshua. The people of Nazareth would not call him Jesus Christ, as if Christ were his surname. Christ comes from a Greek word related to the title of anointed one, equivalent to the idea of Messiah. In his village, he could be identified by his name, by his family, by his origin, or by his occupation. Yeshua of Nazareth, the son of Mary, the son of the artisan himself. Their main language was probably Aramaic, a language used widely in daily communication. The Gospels, although written in Greek, preserve some Aramaic expressions associated with Jesus, such as Talita Kumi, addressed to the girl he calls to rise, and Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, linked to the crucifixion. These small phrases function almost like sound windows. For a few moments we go through the Greek translation, and hear something closer to the everyday language of Jesus. First-century Palestine, however, was multilingual. Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and, in Roman administrative contexts, Latin could be present, although in different proportions and environments. Jesus likely knew the Hebrew used in Scripture and in religious settings. The account of his participation in the synagogue and his constant use of sacred texts indicate familiarity with this tradition. There is debate among scholars about the exact level of command he would have of spoken or read Hebrew, just as there is discussion about how much Greek he could use. Greek was an important language in the Eastern Mediterranean and was present in cities, in trade, and in interactions between different peoples. Galilee was not an island isolated from the Hellenistic world. There were cities marked by Greco-Roman culture, trade routes, and contacts between different populations. Therefore, some researchers consider it possible that Jesus possessed at least a basic ability to communicate in Greek. Others point out that his daily teaching among Jewish villagers would have taken place mainly in Aramaic. The most responsible thing is to recognize the possibility without transforming a hypothesis into certainty. Recent research describes Galilee as a culturally mixed and linguistically more complex environment than previously imagined. Imagine then the voice of Jesus speaking in Aramaic. His parables would have a different rhythm. Word games could sound different. Some sentences may have sound repetitions that disappeared during translation. Certain short teachings would be easy to memorize precisely because of their cadence. In a world in which much knowledge circulated orally, the ability to construct striking sentences was essential. Jesus did not give printed books to his listeners. He spoke. People listened, saved the words, repeated them to family members, and told them again in other villages. A story about a sower needed to remain in memory. A parable about a lost coin needed to be simple enough to travel from mouth to mouth. A phrase about loving your enemies needed to hit the listener hard enough not to be forgotten at the end of the day. His voice, therefore, was one of his main instruments. We don't know if it was serious or acute. We don't know if he spoke slowly. We cannot say that it had a naturally soft tone. The Gospels show very different situations. At times he teaches a crowd. In others, talk in private. Sometimes he responds with a question. In certain confrontations, he uses harsh words. He also speaks tenderly, tells stories, utters warnings, and cries out loud. To be heard by many people without a microphone, Jesus would need to adapt his voice to the environment. By speaking from an elevation, a bank, or a boat close to the beach, you could take advantage of the landscape to reach more listeners. Still, a crowd would not remain completely silent like a modern audience. There would be children, animals, conversations, wind, water, footsteps, and people arriving or leaving. Teaching in this scenario required presence, clarity, and repetition. Maybe Jesus raised his voice much more than movies usually show. Not because he was always angry, but because he needed to be heard. When he said, "He who has ears to hear, listen," that phrase crossed a real environment, full of noise. When he called out to someone in the crowd, he needed to make his voice reach that person. When he discussed in the temple, he spoke in a busy space, frequented by merchants, pilgrims, priests, and families. His accent probably betrayed his Galilean origins. Just as today we recognize regional differences in the way of speaking, inhabitants of other areas could perceive characteristics of the Galilean speech. In the account of Jesus' arrest, people identify Peter as a Galilean because of his way of speaking. This suggests that Jesus and his disciples did not sound exactly like the Jerusalem elite. Think about the impact of this. The voice that would be announced throughout the world probably carried the accent of a peripheral region. Jesus did not speak like a Roman aristocrat, nor necessarily like a priest belonging to the most powerful families. He came from a small village. His way of pronouncing words could reveal that immediately. For some people in the capital, this accent might sound simple. To the inhabitants of Galilee, it would sound familiar. He taught about God using the voice of a man of the people. Translations have preserved the meaning of many teachings, but cannot fully convey the original musicality. When Jesus called God Abba, for example, the word carried a proximity that crossed Greek-speaking Christian communities. When he gave Simon the Aramaic name related to stone, there was a linguistic connection that later translations needed to explain. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the Words of Jesus That Were Removed Now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention! Stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. These words did not come from a silent studio. They were pronounced in small houses, fields, synagogues, paths, and beaches. Some were said during meals, others in the middle of discussions. Some were whispered to the disciples, others were thrown against the roar of a crowd. And how did Jesus dress while teaching? Probably in such a simple way that his clothing did not separate him from the workers and villagers. The basic men's garment was a tunic. Instead of the long white robe that reaches the ankles in traditional images, researchers suggest that ordinary men may have worn shorter tunics, reaching approximately the knee area. Very long tunics could be associated with rich or high-status people, in addition to making certain physical jobs difficult. Jesus would also wear an outer cloak, useful as protection against the sun, wind, and cold of the night. His tunic was not necessarily white. Undyed natural fabrics could be beige, cream, light brown, or grayish. Dyeing fabric required materials and labor, and some colors were more expensive than others. A person of modest means would not keep a wardrobe full of colorful pieces. The cloak could have a darker or more natural tone, perhaps with stripes or simple differences in fabric, but we are unable to reconstruct every detail. The bright white of the paintings conveys theological purity, not necessarily everyday reality. After days on the road, any light fabric would collect dust. The hem of the tunic could stain. Sweat would leave marks. Small tears would be patched instead of causing the piece to be discarded immediately. Clothing was valuable. There was no mass industrial production, and each fabric represented raw material, spinning, weaving, and many hours of work. When Jesus talks about not sewing new cloth into old clothes, his listeners understand the example perfectly. Clothes were used, repaired, and reused. When he mentions someone having 2 tunics and advises them to share them with those who don't have one, he is not describing a full closet. Having an extra piece was already something significant for poor people. It is possible that a tunic worn by Jesus had patches. His cloak had perhaps been repaired more than once. During his itinerant ministry, he and his disciples carried few objects. The clothing needed to withstand travel, temperature changes, and nights in different places. A belt or sash held the tunic at the waist. This allowed you to adjust the fabric while working or walking. The biblical expression equivalent to girding the loins was not just an abstract metaphor, referred to the practical gesture of preparing clothes to act quickly. Regarding the tunic mentioned during the crucifixion, the Gospel of John states that it was woven in one piece without seams. Throughout history, this detail has received symbolic interpretations. Historically, it shows that clothing had enough value that soldiers preferred not to tear it. This does not necessarily mean luxury. Even ordinary clothing represented something usable. Jesus would also wear a cloak. This outer fabric could be placed over the shoulders, wrapped around the body, and used as protection during the night. For a person traveling with few belongings, the cloak was not just decoration. It could almost function as a sleeping cover. The narratives mention people touching the edge or fringe of their clothing. Observant Jews wore fringe on certain robes in obedience to Torah tradition. Therefore, it is plausible to imagine Jesus' cloak with these elements, not as an exotic decoration, but as part of his religious identity. On his feet, Jesus probably wore simple leather sandals. Ancient examples preserved in dry regions show soles held together by straps. They partially protected the feet, but did not prevent dust from entering. After walking, the feet were dirty. This reality explains why washing a visitor's feet was an important gesture of hospitality. The scene in which Jesus washes the disciples' feet gains new strength when we abandon clean images. He is not performing a ritual in front of feet that have just emerged from a bath. He is bowing before tired feet, covered by the dust accumulated on the paths. The gesture was just humble mind because it involved a concrete and unpleasant need. During some walks, a strap could break, the sole would wear out, stones would hurt exposed areas. There were no resistant sneakers, insoles, or paved roads. Walking dozens of kilometers meant feeling the terrain. When the Gospels mention that the disciples shook the dust off their feet, this dust was not just symbolic. She really accompanied the travelers. Did Jesus cover his head? We cannot say with certainty. Many modern images show all men wearing large turbans, but experts warn that this pattern may reflect later representations of the East, not necessarily the exact fashion of the Galilean Jews in the 1st century. A simple fabric could be used in certain situations for sun protection, but we should not automatically imagine the large turbans present in nativity scenes and films. On very hot days, protecting yourself from the sun was important. On cold nights, the cloak wrapped around the body. During rain, clothes could become heavy and take a long time to dry. Life did not happen at a controlled temperature. The body and clothes responded to the climate. Now imagine Jesus arriving at a house after traveling. The entrance does not reveal a spacious, bright, and silent residence. Village houses could be built with stone and mortar, presenting small spaces used by several people. The floor could be made of compacted earth or simple material. Objects were few. Nightlight came from small oil-powered lamps found by archaeology throughout the region. These lamps gave little light, produced smoke, and required fuel. The image of placing a lamp in an elevated position to illuminate the house made sense because a single flame needed to serve everyone. Archaeological finds confirmed the widespread use of oil lamps in Roman Galilee. At night, the faces appeared partially illuminated. Shadows moved on the walls. A conversation around a lamp was very different from a meeting under electric lights. When Jesus taught inside a house, some people crowded near the entrance. Others tried to listen outside. The air could get hot quickly. Children walked around. Animals may have been nearby depending on the household structure. Privacy was limited. In a small house, one person would listen to the others breathing during the night. Families shared spaces. Visitors increased the capacity. People slept on mats, blankets, or simple structures. The soft, single bed that seems common today was an unknown luxury for a large part of the population. Jesus grew up in this kind of communal culture. The modern idea of spending hours completely alone in a closed room was not part of most families' routine. To find solitude, it was necessary to go out, walk to a remote place, climb a hill, or stay awake when others slept. This helps to understand why the Gospels mention Jesus withdrawing to lonely places. It was not just a poetic preference for nature. In crowded villages and shared homes, isolation had to be sought deliberately. Perhaps he would leave before dawn, when the air was still cold. I would walk while the village began to wake up. In the distance, I would hear animals, footsteps, and the first domestic activities. I would look for an area where I could pray without being interrupted. Jesus' prayer was also embedded in Jewish life. He did not appear disconnected from Israel's faith. He grew up listening to the scriptures, participating in the traditions of his people, and learning about religious festivals. Saturday structured the week. Pilgrimages and celebrations marked the year. Prayers and blessings were part of everyday life. Upon waking up, a Jewish family could remember the covenant with God. Before meals, I expressed gratitude. Bread was not consumed as a meaningless object. He was linked to work, blessing, and daily dependence. When Jesus gives thanks before sharing food, he acts within a spiritual universe in which eating and giving thanks were deeply connected. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book, Censored Gospels, The Words of Jesus That Were Removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention, stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. What would Jesus' breakfast be like? It certainly would not include coffee, a drink that would only spread to other regions many centuries later. There would also be no refined sugar, processed cereals, or the products associated with modern breakfast. The first meal could be simple: bread, leftover food, olives, available fruit, or some previously prepared product. The bread is the central, not the soft sliced white bread from supermarkets, but breads made with ground grains, water and fermentation, or simple preparation. The process began long before the dough reached the fire. Grains needed to be harvested, separated, crushed, and turned into flour. Grinding grain was a tiring daily task, often carried out by women in the family. Therefore, when Jesus talks about yeast mixed with flour, about bread requested by a friend at night, or about not living on bread alone, he talks about something present in everyone's routine. The diet of simple people in Galilee could include cereals, legumes, olives, olive oil, fruits, vegetables, fish in areas close to the lake, wine and produce available according to the season. Meat probably didn't appear every day on the table of modest families. It could be linked to festivals, sacrifices, or special occasions. Differences in wealth profoundly influenced food, and archaeology shows that Galilee had economic diversity, with villagers, workers, owners, and elites living very different realities. Jesus knew hunger not just as a spiritual metaphor. In their world, a bad harvest, debt, illness, or loss of work could quickly threaten a family's security. There was no modern public protection network. Survival depended on land, community, relatives, and economic relationships that often favored the most powerful. When he teaches how to ask for daily bread, the phrase does not sound abstract to those who do not know whether there will be enough food tomorrow. When he multiplies bread before a hungry crowd, the food is not a secondary detail. When his disciples pick ears of corn as they walk, they are responding to a bodily need. Perhaps Jesus ate with his hands, using pieces of bread to pick up other foods. Utensils existed, but the table was not arranged like a modern Western dinner. People could sit on mats, low benches, or recline at more formal meals. Bowls and plates were shared. Sharing a meal meant more than consuming calories. It was a social statement. Eating with someone demonstrated acceptance, closeness, and often, honor. This explains why Jesus' meals caused so much controversy. He didn't just talk to tax collectors and people considered sinners. He sat at the table with them. He shared the bread. He entered their homes. He accepted hospitality. For a culture where the table showed each person's position, this behavior was powerful. When you imagine Jesus eating, don't always place him in the center of a long table looking solemnly straight ahead. In most meals, there was no composition similar to the famous painting of the Last Supper. He would be surrounded by voices, movement, shared bowls, and people standing close to each other. Someone would break bread. Another would pass a portion. A child could interrupt. A guest would ask a question. An argument would begin. Jesus taught within this life. Some of his best-known words appear around the table. He observes places of honor, tells stories, responds to criticism, allows people to get closer, use bread and wine as signs. Spirituality does not happen far from routine, takes place in its center. We also need to abandon the idea that Jesus lived permanently in isolated poverty without any support. During the ministry, the Gospels mention people who welcomed him into their homes and women who contributed resources. This indicates a hospitality chain. Some days he could sleep outdoors. In others, he would stay at the home of friends, disciples, or supporters. Capernaum seems to have functioned as a kind of base for part of his activities in Galilee. There, houses, streets, boats, and activities related to fishing formed the scene. Nazareth, his village of origin, was in a hilly region. Jerusalem, on the other hand, presented a much more intense reality, especially during the festivals, when pilgrims greatly increased the city's movement. The difference between a Galilean village and Jerusalem would be striking. In Nazareth, many inhabitants knew each other. A person's family defined part of their identity. News circulated quickly. A young man was not just an individual, he was someone's son, someone's brother, a member of a certain house. When Jesus begins to teach publicly, his countrymen remember his origins. They know your family and your occupation. Familiarity becomes an obstacle. How does that man they watched grow up now speak that way? Such a reaction reveals something important. For many years, Jesus lived without attracting the attention of the village as an extraordinary public figure. People knew him within the common categories of the community. ID. He worked, participated in local life, and was recognized as a member of a family. The Gospels do not tell what his childhood games were like, who his friends were, or what work he did for the first time. Later texts attempted to fill this silence with imaginative stories, but they do not have the same historical value as older records. We need to resist the temptation to invent. Still, we can rebuild the environment. As a child, Jesus likely grew up surrounded by relatives and neighbors. He learned tasks by observing adults. Knowledge did not depend only on formal schools. Children participated in the family routine, listened to stories, memorized traditions, and took on responsibilities as they grew. He would have heard accounts of Abraham, Moses, David, the prophets, and the deliverance from Egypt. These narratives were not just ancient stories, formed the identity of their people. The land, festivals, and religious practices continually reminded that Israel had a covenant with God. Perhaps while still young, Jesus accompanied family members on pilgrimages. The path to Jerusalem would bring together groups, songs, conversations, and precautions against dangers. Traveling alone was risky. People moved in company, especially on long journeys. As you approached Jerusalem, the city and the temple would dominate the experience. For a young person coming from a village, the scale of the buildings, the movement of pilgrims, the priests, the sacrificial animals, and the sounds of religious activities would have a strong impact. The temple was not a silent church as many people imagine. It was a huge religious, political, and economic complex. There were prayers, teachings, inspections, offerings, animals, traders, coins, and crowds. The smell of smoke and sacrifices was part of the atmosphere. Roman soldiers observed the region especially during periods of great popular concentration. Jesus grew up under Roman rule. Judea and Galilee were inserted in a complex political reality, with rulers linked to Rome, local elites, tribute collection, and tensions between different Jewish groups. In Galilee, Herod Antipas ruled for much of Jesus' adult life. In Judea, Roman authorities exercised direct control at certain periods. The British Museum records that Judea was under strong Roman rule since before the birth of Jesus, with Herodian rulers and later Roman prefects. This means that Jesus saw signs of the empire. Coins bore symbols and names associated with power. Taxes reminded who controlled the region. Large construction projects demonstrated concentrated wealth. Soldiers and authorities represented the possibility of violence. Crucifixion, long before it became a religious symbol, was a public and terrifying Roman punishment. When Jesus talks about giving Caesar what belongs to Caesar, the question takes place within a world in which taxation was deeply political. When his followers discuss power and kingdoms, they are not using distant concepts. They live in a land where kings, governors, and soldiers decide the fate of ordinary people. Jesus didn't need to watch the news to know what empire meant. The empire was in the roads, in the currencies, and in the structures of authority. Perhaps you have worked in areas influenced by urban projects. Near Nazareth was Sepphoris, an important city rebuilt during his youth. There is no proof that Jesus or Joseph worked there, although the proximity makes the possibility interesting. It is an example of a hypothesis that must remain a hypothesis. We can't turn it into a proven scene just because it seems plausible. This distinction is key throughout this video. The more we desire to know Jesus, the greater the temptation may be to fill in the blanks with certainty. But historical honesty requires saying, "We don't know" many times. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention. Stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. We don't know if Jesus had any visible scars before the crucifixion. We don't know if there were prematurely gray strands in her hair. We don't know the shape of his face. We don't know if his voice was deep. We don't know if he smiled often, although his relationships and stories allow us to imagine moments of joy. We don't know if his favorite tunic was a specific color. We don't know exactly how many languages he spoke fluently. What we do know is that he did not live as a still image. Jesus was sweating, breathing, and felt his clothes weighing down his body. I needed to stop to eat. Your hair is Eshia. Her nails accumulated dirt from travel and work. Your throat could feel dry after teaching. The feet hurt. Sleep arrived. Imagine a morning of ministry. Before the sun fully appears, someone awakens in the house. The small flame on the lamp may still be burning or may need to be relit. People get up from the mats. The environment is reorganized because the same space can be used for sleeping, talking, and eating. Water needs to be fetched or removed from a stored container. The bread is prepared or separated. Jesus wakes up among other people. There is no private room reserved for him. Perhaps a disciple is still sleeping. Another is already talking in a low voice. Outside, the village begins to produce its sounds. He gets up, adjusts his tunic, puts on his cloak according to the temperature, and fastens his sandals. Your face doesn't go through a modern care routine. Water is precious and must be used conscientiously. Washing doesn't mean standing in a shower. A container, a basin, and small amounts of water fulfill the function. Practices of ritual purity were also part of the Jewish world, although they varied between groups and regions. Archaeology has found ritual baths, stone containers, and other signs linked to Jewish religious life. But this does not mean that everyone took full baths daily, as is the case in many modern societies. Cleansing, bathing, ritual purification, and availability of water were different issues. Jesus leaves. Maybe there is fog near the lake. Maybe the day is already dry in the hills. If it's the rainy season, the path may be muddy. If it's summer, the heat will build quickly. Crowds don't magically appear. News travels from person to person. Someone heard about a cure. Another heard a parable and repeated it at home. A relative decides to bring a sick person. People travel distances because they believe they will find something. When Jesus arrives at the place where he will teach, some are already waiting. Others arrive later. There is no stage set up. Neither team controls the crowd. There is no sound box, organized security, or access corridor. The disciples try to manage the proximity, but people move on. They want to touch him. This image becomes more intense when we remember that Jesus had a vulnerable body. A pressing crowd could bring him down. Desperate people grabbed his clothes. Children tried to get closer. Patients were looking for space. Curious people asked questions. Critics watched every gesture. After hours, he would be tired. Maybe your voice would become hoarse. Maybe I needed to drink water. Maybe he would sit down. The Gospels frequently show Jesus teaching while sitting, a common posture for a teacher. He could sit on the ground, on a rock, in a house, or in a boat. Listeners would position themselves around. When talking about seeds, everyone knew the movement of a hand throwing grain. When mentioning birds, it was possible to see them in the sky. When talking about lilies and plants, elements of the landscape were close. When he described a house built on rock or sand, his listeners knew about rain capable of revealing the fragility of a construction. Jesus' teaching smelled of earth. He did not use examples taken from distant palaces. It spoke of a woman preparing dough, a fisherman separating fish, a farmer discovering something in the field, a shepherd looking for a sheep, a father waiting for his son, workers waiting for payment, and neighbors asking for bread. These stories show how much Jesus observed daily life. He noticed small gestures. He knew how a woman looked for a lost coin. I knew the anxiety related to debt. He understood the importance of a harvest. He saw conflicts between brothers and disputes over inheritance. I watched the way guests chose the best seats. Maybe his appearance was ordinary, but his attentiveness was not. Jesus saw meaning in things that people passed by every day without noticing. A seed was transformed into an image of the kingdom. A lamp spoke about revelation. Salt explained influence. Bread became a sign of life. The water pointed to renewal. This way of teaching required more than religious knowledge. It required deep contact with everyday life. He knew fishing even though he was not presented as a professional fisherman. He spent time around the lake and socialized with fishermen. I knew that nets needed to be cleaned, repaired, launched, and pulled. He understood that a night of work could end without results. He knew the risk of storms and the frustration of looking for fish. The Sea of Galilee is actually a large freshwater lake, surrounded by high elevations and subject to rapid changes in wind. Fishing boats were small compared to modern vessels. When a storm arose, there was no powerful engine, radio, or rescue service. Water entering the boat represented a threat. It's real. Jesus sleeping during a crossing reveals exhaustion. It's not easy to sleep on a small moving boat surrounded by men and equipment. If he managed to stay asleep while the weather worsened, perhaps the accumulated fatigue was profound. When they wake him up, he doesn't emerge from a comfortable bed. Get up in that tight space, under wind and water. The spiritual scene takes place within a physical experience. After reaching the other bank, there is no guarantee of rest. People may be waiting. Someone runs to tell him he's arrived. Another need appears. The ministry does not follow an organized agenda with predictable intervals. On some occasions, Jesus and the disciples are not even able to eat calmly. This should not be romanticized as if ignoring the body were a permanent virtue. The texts show the pressure caused by the crowds. Jesus tries to take the disciples to a remote place to rest, but the people arrive first. He feels compassion and goes back to teaching. This compassion costs energy. It's easy to admire the result and forget about the wear and tear. Each person served represents time. Every discussion demands attention. Each trip consumes strength. Jesus doesn't press a button to disappear at the end. He needs to walk back, find shelter, and face the next day. That's why his moments of nightly prayer are so remarkable. After the voices subside, he still seeks silence. The body asks for rest, but there are decisions, anguish, and a mission that leads it to stay awake. Perhaps Jesus' face carried signs of this rhythm, not the eternally serene face of the paintings, but the face of someone who knows both peace and heaviness. The Gospels present strong emotions. Jesus is amazed at the faith of some people, gets angry in certain situations, feel compassion, cry, anguish, rejoice, amen, reprimands. None of these emotions happen without physical expression. When you feel sorry, your look and posture probably change. When confronting merchants in the temple, your voice should not sound like smooth reading. When he cries at the tomb of Lazarus, tears run down his royal face. When you hug or welcome a child, there is bodily closeness. The idea of a Jesus who never smiled is also difficult to reconcile with his presence at meals, parties, and meetings. The Gospels do not directly record a phrase like Jesus laughed, but he was accused by critics of attending banquets and interacting openly with people. His parables contain exaggerations capable of provoking surprise and even humor. Imagine someone trying to remove a small speck from someone else's eye while carrying a huge beam into their own eye. The image is deliberately absurd. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention, stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. Jesus knew how to use contrast. A camel trying to pass through the eye of a needle is an impossible and memorable image. A man lighting a lamp and then hiding it under a container acts ridiculously. A shepherd leaving many sheep to look for a single lost one causes unrest. Their stories were not pronounced like lifeless texts. They sparked a reaction. Perhaps some listeners laughed before realizing the story was about them. His humanity included humor, irony, and social intelligence. He knew how to answer dangerous questions without falling into traps. In some debates, he returned the question. In others, he told a story that forced the opponent to judge himself. This helps us imagine your face in motion. Eyebrows might be raised when asking a question. A brief silence could precede the response. He would look at the listeners. Maybe he gestured with his hands. When he drew attention to a child, a coin, a tree, or a loaf of bread, he could point to or hold the object. Jesus did not teach motionless like a statue. Your body was part of the communication. He leaned over to play. He sat down to teach. He got up to read. He raised his eyes. He extended his hand. Break the bread. He wrote on the floor in an episode preserved in the Gospel of John. He washed feet. He hugged children. The hands of a worker become the hands of a master without ceasing to be human hands. And there was the smell. This is a detail that images cannot convey. Jesus' world had intense odors. Smoke from lamps, animals, fish, sweat, wet earth, dust, baking bread, olive oil, wine, herbs, leather, and crowds. Jerusalem during the sacrifices would have strong smells. Boats and nets carried the odor of fish and water. Small houses concentrated aromas of food and people. Jesus lived in this environment. Your clothes, they absorbed smoke and dust. After a long walk, he would smell like someone who walked in the sun. Perfumes were familiar, but quality aromatic substances could be expensive. Therefore, When a woman pours valuable perfume on him, everyone immediately realizes the importance and cost of the gesture. The aroma fills the room. This detail from the Gospel comes to life when we recognize that perfumes were not trivialized by industrial products. A valuable container, broken or opened, released something extraordinary. Some consider it wasteful. Jesus interprets it as love and preparation. The body also received oil. In a dry climate, oils could be used on skin, hair, care, and gestures of hospitality. Anointing a visitor's head could express honor. Not offering foot water or oil could show a lack of consideration. Therefore, the scenes of bodily care in the Gospels are not superficial. They reveal position, acceptance, and social intimacy. How did Jesus take care of his own beard and hair during his travels? We don't know. Perhaps he used the resources available in the homes that received him. Maybe he would cut his hair periodically with someone's help. Metal mirrors existed, but they did not offer the clarity of a modern mirror. Your appearance would not be checked repeatedly throughout the day. He was not worried about maintaining a public visual image. There were no photographs. No disciple chose the best angle. People remembered his presence through memory. After his death, different communities could imagine him in different ways. As Christianity spread, artists began to represent it using models, symbols, and styles from their own cultures. The first Christian images do not always feature the same Jesus. Some show him young and without a beard. Others adopt characteristics associated with philosophers, shepherds, emperors, or deities known in the Roman world. Over time, the image of long hair and a beard became dominant. These representations communicated theological ideas such as wisdom, authority, and royalty, but they did not function as preserved photographs. Joan Taylor herself notes that artistic models were influenced by depictions of rulers and religious figures from the ancient world. Afterwards, each region brought Jesus closer to itself. European artists painted him with European features. African communities created images with African characteristics. Asian people represented Jesus with features close to their populations. In part, this expressed the belief that Christ could be recognized in all humanity. The problem arises when one of these cultural images starts to be presented as the true historical portrait. Jesus was not European, but we must also avoid replacing one caricature with another. There is no single Middle Eastern face. The region has always presented diversity. We cannot randomly select a modern person and claim that Jesus was exactly the same. Populations change, mix, and show great internal variation. The most the story offers is a range of possibilities. Probably olive or brown skin, dark hair, brown eyes, beard, height similar to the average for men in the region, simple clothes, body accustomed to work and walks, face exposed to the weather. Within that range, details remain unknown. Maybe his nose was wide. Maybe it was narrow. Perhaps the face was rounded or elongated. Maybe he had a mark on his eyebrow. Maybe one of your teeth wasn't perfectly aligned. These possibilities remind us of something important. Jesus' historical body was not produced to meet modern standards of beauty. Paintings often present it with almost perfect symmetry because artists wanted to communicate holiness. But a real person has small asymmetries. One side of the smile may rise higher than the other. An eyebrow can be different. The skin has marks, lines, and textures. There is no historical or theological reason to imagine Jesus as the man considered most beautiful by current standards. An ancient tradition interpreted prophetic passages in different ways. Some emphasized beauty and majesty. Others, lack of attractive appearance. But the Gospels do not record crowds following Jesus because of his face. They look to him for his words, healings, and signs. Maybe he was considered handsome by some people and ordinary by others. Human attraction does not work uniformly. What seems striking to someone may go unnoticed by another. But his presence seemed to provoke decisions. Some people abandoned activities to follow him. Others were irritated. Some felt exposed. Others found hope. Children approached. Marginalized people believed they could speak to and lead. Authorities perceived danger. This impact did not depend on eye color, It depended on the way Jesus related to whoever was before him. In a society organized by honor, purity, family, wealth, gender, and social status, he crossed borders. He talked publicly with people that others avoided. He touched individuals considered impure. He praised foreigners. It would allow women to join its network of followers. It placed children at the center of a discussion between adults. Each gesture had social meaning. When Jesus touches a leper, he does not just make physical contact. Approach someone accustomed to distance. When a woman touches his clothes in the crowd, he stops and tries to find out who did it. When he looks at Zacchaeus and decides to stay in his house, he transforms a despised man into a host. Jesus' face in these moments is turned towards people who rarely received attention. Maybe that's why so many remembered him, not because they could describe every feature, but because they remembered what it was like to be seen by him. Think of Bartimaeus, shouting by the roadside while others tell him to be silent. The noise of the crowd continues. Jesus stops. In the midst of so many steps, he notices that voice. Send for him. Suddenly, the man who was on the sidelines becomes the center of the scene. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention. Stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. Imagine the face of Jesus turning toward you. We don't know the shape of this face, but we know he stopped. Now think of a child taken to him. The disciples try to prevent the approach, perhaps believing that too important matters were being discussed. Jesus is indignant, receives children and sets them as an example. In a world of hierarchies, your body creates space. Does he bend down? Put a child on your lap? Hold your hand? The texts summarize the scene, but the gesture requires real proximity. Children observe expressions. They notice when an adult is impatient or welcoming. They would not approach just one doctrine. They approached a person. There are also times when Jesus' face must have provoked fear. When he enters the temple space and interrupts commercial activities, he does not seem like the passive character in some paintings. Acts in a prophetic and confrontational way. Tables are affected. Coins fall. Animals and people move. Authorities question his action. Your working body occupies that space. His Galilean voice challenges the capital's structures. The same hand that touches the sick also points out hypocrisy. The same mouth that speaks of mercy pronounces warnings. Jesus' humanity does not mean a personality that is always pleasant according to everyone's expectations. He could be disconcerting. If you have been following this journey so far, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell because we still need to reconstruct the most forgotten part of Jesus' life. What his day was like when no crowd surrounded him, how he handled money, where he went about his business, how he slept during his travels, and what it meant to live without the most basic resources that we now take for granted. These questions may seem too simple, but they are precisely what remove Jesus from the paintings and place him back on the roads of Galilee. Let's start with money. Jesus and the disciples needed resources. Even a group committed to a simple life needed to eat, replace sandals, find shelter, and deal with travel expenses. The Gospels mention a common purse and people who helped the movement. Judas appears associated with the administration of these resources in some accounts. Women such as Maria Magdalena, Joanna, and Susanna are mentioned among those who offered support. This shows that the ministry had a practical dimension. Someone needed to think about the next meal. Someone knew how much was left. Someone accepted an offer or bought something. Trust between participants was necessary. The movement did not function only through constant miracles that eliminated all daily needs. Jesus also knew coins. His teachings mentioned denarii, drachmas, and other units. A coin could bear images linked to imperial power. Holding one of them meant touching a political object. When he asks them to show the tribute coin, he transforms something every day into a question about loyalty, power, and belonging. Poor people might see few high-value coins. Part of the economy could involve local exchanges, products, and relationships. Workers waited for payment at the end of the day because they depended on it to live. In the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the about salary is not theoretical. A day without pay could mean a home without food. Jesus looks at this economic world and talks repeatedly about debt. In prayer, the forgiveness of sins is expressed in language that can also refer to debts. Parables feature servants owing impossible amounts, creditors, administrators, and owners. Debt could destroy families, lead to loss of land, and place people under the control of others. When Jesus announces good news to the poor, his listeners don't just think of emotional poverty, they know the concrete lack. At the same time, he circulates through the homes of people with different conditions. Some homes appear large enough to accommodate groups. Certain supporters had resources. Tax collectors could host banquets. Women contributed financially. The Jesus movement cut across social layers even though its message strongly confronted attachment to wealth. This diversity shows in the clothes around him. A rich man could wear better quality fabrics, more intense colors, longer pieces, and accessories that indicated position. A worker would present simple, worn clothes. Priests had clothing related to their religious function. Roman soldiers wore equipment that immediately set them apart. Jesus saw status before anyone even spoke. Clothes functioned as language. The quality of the fabric, the length, the cleanliness, and the embellishments communicated resources. Therefore, his simple clothing placed him visually close to common people. Even when he is treated as a master, he does not depend on luxurious clothing to demonstrate authority. Washing clothes was laborious. Water had to be obtained. Fabrics were scrubbed, rinsed, and dried. There were no modern detergents, machines, or dryers. Certain natural substances could help with cleaning. Still, stains persisted and wear was inevitable. An itinerant person might have little opportunity to wash all the items. During a longer stop, clothing could be cleaned. While it was drying, it would be necessary to use another piece or organize the moment carefully. Having few clothes made everything more complicated. What about physiological needs? The Gospels do not talk about this because their authors did not intend to write a modern biography. But Jesus had a human body and needed to handle the same basic functions. Sanitary facilities varied. Large cities and Roman structures could have more developed systems, but villages and travel required simple solutions, remote areas, and practices established by the community. There was no industrial toilet paper, private bathroom, or running water in each house. Rules of cleanliness and purity helped organize these needs. For those who traveled, finding a suitable place was part of the routine. Talking about it is not disrespectful. It would be disrespectful to say that Jesus assumed humanity, and then imagine humanity without a body. Christian tradition insists that he was not an appearance, a spirit in disguise, or an image that pretended to feel. He ate, drank, slept, and suffered. The reality of incarnation makes even the most mundane aspects of life meaningful. Did Jesus also get sick? The Gospels do not record a specific illness suffered by him. We cannot say that you had a fever, infection, or any condition. But living in the first century involved exposure to much greater health risks than today. Contaminated water, injuries, parasites, poorly preserved food, and infectious diseases were part of the ancient world. Archaeological studies of Roman Palestine analyze health conditions and the dangers faced by the population, although they do not allow for an individual diagnosis of Jesus. It is possible that, like anyone else, you have faced some discomfort throughout your more than 30 years of life. But this remains speculation. The important thing is to realize that there were no antibiotics, tests, modern anesthesia, or hospitals as we know them. A cut while working required care. An infection could become serious. Toothache was not easily resolved. Vision problems did not receive affordable glasses. Many people lived with illnesses and disabilities without effective treatment. When crowds bring the sick to Jesus, we see the dimension of an immense social need. People weren't just looking for a spiritual experience. They were looking for relief because their options were limited. Some patients were completely dependent on their family. Others asked for alms. Certain conditions caused exclusion. The disease could be interpreted morally or religiously, increasing suffering. Jesus often breaks this automatic link between illness and individual guilt. He approaches, asks, touches, and returns people to the community. Touching was part of his ministry. Imagine the texture of these hands over the eyes of a blind man, under the skin of a sick person, or on the shoulders of someone hunched over. These are not luminous hands on a screen. They are hands warmed by the body, marked by work and perhaps covered in dust. When healing using saliva in some accounts, Jesus acts in a way that may seem strange to the modern reader, but which fits into practices and symbolism of the ancient world. He doesn't work inside a sterile clinic, acts in people's environment, using gestures that are understandable in that context. Their physical proximity also exposed him. Touching patients could bring risk. Entering houses put him in contact with different conditions. Crowds facilitated the transmission of diseases. Still, he does not organize his mission based on the absolute preservation of his own safety. This does not mean recklessness. At times, it avoids regions or withdraws in the face of threats. Jesus perceives the political danger. When they try to arrest or kill him before the final moment, he moves away. Courage does not eliminate conscience. During the trips, other risks existed: robbers, animals, accidents, and climate change. The parable of the Good Samaritan features a man attacked on a road because that kind of danger was understandable. Traveling in a group offered some protection. Jesus and the disciples probably walked together, talking along the way. Not all teaching took place in front of crowds. Many questions arise along the way. The disciples argue among themselves. Jesus notices and confronts them. At other times, he explains a parable in a particular way. Imagine those miles of conversation. Sandals scrape the floor. Someone carries water or food. Another complains about the heat. A disciple asks how much is left. Maybe they'll stop in the shade. Jesus points to a plantation and transforms what they see into teaching. Walking creates intimacy. After many days, they get to know each other's habits. They know who walks faster, who takes longer to wake up, who talks too much, and who realizes first when food is running out. The group of disciples was not a collection of silent statues. It was made up of different personalities capable of competing, making mistakes, and arguing. Jesus lived with this daily. He needed to repeat teachings. The disciples did not always understand. Sometimes they interpreted literally what was symbolic. At times they showed ambition. They wanted to know who was the greatest. They tried to keep people away. They reacted with fear. Jesus' patience was not exercised before perfect followers. We can also imagine light moments. After crossing a difficult path, someone could make an amusing observation. During a meal, stories would be told. Friends do not live only in solemn speeches. The Gospels preserve what served the author's message, not a transcription of all conversations. Pedro, for example, appears as impulsive. Tomé questions. João and Tiago receive a nickname related to thunder. Nicknames are generally born from coexistence, personality, and humor. Jesus did not relate to his followers only by formal titles. He knew their families. He enters Pedro's house and finds his mother-in-law sick. This shows that at least some disciples were married. When you call them, you don't automatically erase your previous relationships. Follow-up causes real changes and tensions. How did families react to the removal of men from their activities? Who assumed certain responsibilities? How long were they out? The texts are not completely responsive, but discipleship had a social and economic cost. Jesus' own family appears worried at one point. His brothers do not always understand his mission. Maria follows important events, but also experiences the difficulty of seeing her son exposed to conflicts. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention, stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. Jesus does not appear without ties. He is known as the Son of Mary. It has brothers and sisters mentioned in the Gospels, although Christian traditions disagree on the exact interpretation of these terms and the degree of kinship. The important thing historically is that people identified it within a family network. And Jose? He appears in childhood accounts but disappears from adult ministry narratives. Many conclude that he died before this stage, although the texts do not describe when or how. If this happened, Jesus experienced grief within his own family before his public ministry. But again, we need to present it as a possibility, not a documented certainty. If he had been the eldest son present, he might have assumed responsibility additional ages. The death of a father could change the economic situation of the entire household. Work and support among relatives became even more important. Jesus' silent years may have been busy. To work, help the family, participate in the community, go to synagogue, traveling to parties, talk to neighbors, learn, observe, pray. There was no applause. Perhaps this is one of the most surprising parts of your life. Most of Jesus' years took place outside of public attention. He began his ministry around the age of 30, spent decades living in a relatively ordinary way, and only a short period traveling as a well-known teacher. In other words, for a long time no one woke up saying, "Today we will see the famous Jesus of Nazareth." He was the man who worked there. Someone might come to him for a repair. A neighbor would ask for help. A child would meet him on the way. People would negotiate the value of a service. Maybe a customer would complain. Maybe a job needed to be redone. Jesus knew life before he became the subject of crowds. This experience appears in the way he talks about faithfulness in small things. He knows that much of existence happens without witnesses. A house remains standing because someone worked on the foundation correctly, even when no one sees it. A seed grows hidden. The yeast silently transforms the dough. A woman turns on the lamp inside her house, far from the great centers of power. The kingdom of God, in his parables, often starts small, perhaps because Jesus knew the value of a small life in the eyes of the world. Nazareth was not Rome. It wasn't Alexandria. It wasn't even Jerusalem. When someone asks if anything good can come from Nazareth, it reveals the contempt associated with the place. And yet that is where Jesus grows. He does not choose the appearance of an emperor. Emperors were represented on coins, statues, and monuments. Their faces circled. Jesus left no statue. No coins were minted. He didn't build a palace. His face disappeared from material history, while his words remained. This contrast is extraordinary. The most represented man in history did not leave a confirmed portrait. The man whose face appears in millions of images remains physically unknown. Perhaps this allowed different people to imagine him close. But it also forces us to remember that the real Jesus was not born into our culture. He belonged to a specific people, time, and land. He was Jewish. This truth cannot be treated as a detail. Jesus was circumcised, participated in Jewish festivals, quoted the Torah and the prophets, attended synagogues, and discussed interpretations of the law with other Jews. Their debates were not generally confrontations between Christianity and Judaism, as if they were two completely separate religions at that time. Christianity did not yet exist as an independent world tradition in the form we know. Jesus argued within the Jewish world. Pharisees, Sadducees, priests, teachers, and movements presented different views on purity, resurrection, temple, authority, and behavior. Disagreeing was part of this religious life. When Jesus criticizes certain leaders, he is not rejecting his own people as a whole. Centuries of Christian anti-Semitism have distorted this reality and turned internal conflicts into accusations against all Jews. Reconstructing the historical Jesus requires correcting this error. His face was a Jewish face. His mother was Jewish. His disciples were Jews. The first people who believed in him were Jews. The scriptures he quoted belonged to the tradition of Israel. The festivals he celebrated told the story of his people. At Easter, the liberation from Egypt was remembered. During other celebrations, the community relives events and promises. Jerusalem was filled with pilgrims. Families traveled together. Animals were taken. Accommodation became difficult. The city was tense because large crowds also worried Rome. Jesus' last week takes place in this explosive environment. He enters the city surrounded by expectations. Some people receive it publicly. His actions in the temple increase the tension. Religious and political authorities perceive risk. Rome did not easily tolerate movements that could produce instability. The travel-weary face is now seen. Questions become traps. People try to get him to say something that could lead to an accusation. Betrayal is negotiated. A final meal brings the disciples together, and even on that night Jesus continues to experience human needs. He wants company. He asks the disciples to remain awake, feel deep anguish. His prayer is not uttered by someone indifferent to death. The body reacts to fear and pressure. Religious images sometimes make the garden too beautiful, but that night involves abandonment, darkness, and fear. Strict. Jesus knows that armed men are coming. When he is arrested, he is not wearing a royal robe. It has no protection. His followers flee. He is taken between authorities, interrogated, and exposed to violence. The appearance begins to change quickly. Tiredness from a sleepless night, stress, aggression, and injuries change the face. The skin swells. Blood appears. Clothing is affected. The serene image gives way to the body of a prisoner. We won't go into graphic descriptions, but we need to recognize that the crucifixion did not preserve visual dignity. It was designed to humiliate. Rome transformed the body of the condemned into a public warning. The cross was not created as a jewel. It was an instrument of power. Therefore, the first Christian communities faced enormous difficulty when announcing a crucified Messiah. The image looked like failure, shame, and defeat. Over time, it became the center of the Christian faith. But its first listeners knew the brutality behind the symbol. The face of Jesus on the cross would not be the clean face of the paintings. It would be the face of someone subjected to the violence of the empire. After his death, the Gospels state that followers found his tomb empty and had experiences in which they saw him alive. The resurrection belongs to the center of the Christian faith, while historians analyze the texts and the emergence of this conviction without having the tools to theologically test the miracle. Historical research distinguishes what it can investigate from what belongs to faith. Studies on the historical Jesus themselves remind us that the Gospels are ancient sources also shaped by religious objectives, and that many details remain debated. Don't waste any more time living with this burden. Get the digital book Censored Gospels, the words of Jesus that were removed now, and discover how to apply these powerful teachings in your daily life. Attention, stock is limited and running out quickly. Click now and start your journey towards the peace and confidence you deserve. Interestingly, even in the resurrection narratives, Jesus is not always immediately recognized. Maria Magdalena initially mistakes him for the person responsible for the garden. 2 disciples walk with him without realizing who he is. On the shore of the lake, others are slow to recognize it. These scenes have received many theological interpretations. They cannot be used to reconstruct your exact appearance, but they maintain the theme of recognition. What makes Maria recognize him? He calls your name. It is not a description of the face. It's a voice and a relationship. The disciples of Emmaus recognize him when he breaks the bread. Again, it's a gesture. On the shore of the lake, fishing and eating awaken memories. Recognition happens for what Jesus does. Perhaps the Gospels are leading the reader beyond physical curiosity. You want to know what his face looked like, but the texts ask if you would recognize his voice, his compassion, his way of breaking bread, and his treatment of the forgotten. Still, wanting to imagine what you look like is not wrong. It can help us take it out of an abstraction. Imagine again Jesus walking along a road in Galilee. He is not alone. The tunic reaches approximately the knees. A simple cloak covers part of the shoulders. The fabric tones are natural, not bright. There is dust on the sandals. The legs show marks from walking. The skin is punished by the sun. Dark hair is relatively short, but not perfectly trimmed. The beard grows naturally. His eyes are brown. His height doesn't make him stand out dramatically from the group. A passing traveler might not look twice. Then someone asks about God. Jesus stops. Your body turns. He listens before responding. Maybe watch the person for a few seconds. Around, others continue walking. A disciple shows haste, but Jesus remains. It is at that moment that something changes. We don't know if his voice was deep, but we know that people saved his words. We don't know the design of her smile, but we know that children were welcomed. We don't know the shape of their hands, but we know who they touched. We don't know his height, but we know he bent down to wash feet. A person's true appearance is not just based on facial measurements. It's in the way your body occupies the world. Jesus occupied the world by drawing near. He sat near despised people. He entered unpopular houses. He walked alongside confused disciples. It would allow someone to interrupt your journey. It played before being touched. I cried in the face of pain.